let's get started. Our first thread of the day is titled Grandparents' Rights. Should grandparents see their grandchildren when they want to or when the parents allow them to? My spouse thinks his parents should be able to see our daughter whenever they want to. Now, you can kind of already see from the thread that this is not really a genuine question. Like, obviously, the answer is that grandparents should see the grandchildren when the parents allow them to, which is fair enough. I think that that's a very different idea and a very different concept from the idea of grandparent rights, which I guess is the question of, do grandparents have a right to their grandchildren? And I think that that's quite complicated. To some extent, I almost want to say, yeah, maybe they should. But honestly, I say that kind of it would be a little bit hypocritical of me to say so, because our son, for example, does not have equal, both sides of our family do not have equal access to our son. And that's obviously a conscious decision that we made as parents. I think fundamentally, the question of rights when it comes to grandparents, it's a perfect situation where the idea of privilege versus a right comes into play. So a right is something that kind of the universe owes you by virtue of your existence. You don't need to do anything to earn it. You don't need to change anything about yourself. It's like the right to life, right? You just have the right to life in theory, or at least we as a society want to guarantee that for people. And I think that with grandparents, it's very much one of those cases where it really depends a lot and very, very fundamentally on the type of relationship that you develop with your children and then as adults. And I don't think that this is something that you can back away from. So if you want, you can earn the right to engage with your grandchildren, because then, of course, if you have a great relationship with your kids, then they would never want to take their children away from you. And then the question is, at what point does that go too far? And I think quite a lot of grandparents take it too far by thinking that they have as equal right to the grandchildren as, for example, the parents do, which is obviously fundamentally wrong. Now, the problem with this framing here and what OP wants to get at is when she says, hey, my spouse thinks his parents should be able to see our daughter whenever they want to. She gives the impression that there's basically zero restriction. From her husband's side, there is not a single situation or a single circumstance in which he'd say, okay, you know what, maybe not today. And I think OP's frustration is coming more from this angle of they are guaranteed access to our kid no matter what, rather than saying, hey, I have a serious concern about allowing your parents to have access to our child because of these and these and these reasons. So, for example, abusive reasons, the way that they interact, whether they would harm the child in some kind of way, whatever it might be. Those are the types of circumstances where I would say, okay, if you are forced to cut down on your contact with your parents for whatever reason, then of course it's not really fair, and it wouldn't make any sense if you then say, all right, but I'm happy for my parents to still interact with my child. And that's a very different circumstance from, I'm just annoyed at having to deal with them all the time and we're seeing them too regularly and I don't want to do that. Now we're going to go into some of the comments here and you'll see that OP's primary problem is really just how often they are seeing the grandparents. And under those circumstances, it's quite clear to say, you just need to get on the same page as your husband here. So I don't think that coming on the internet and writing a thread like this and then showing him hundreds of people saying, yeah, well, of course, it's, the grandparents don't have rights to your kids, is going to be the thing that really changes his opinion. If I were OP, I would say the fundamental problem that you're trying to solve is how you interact with your husband and getting on the same page, agreeing there. What's a reasonable cadence that they should, that your grandparents should visit, for example. So the very first comment says, in my opinion, when parents say grandparents are not entitled to seeing their grandchildren, I think you should definitely be reasonable, though. If they live close and want to visit daily, that's a no. If they're looking at once a month or once a week, then okay. I love my in-laws dearly, but would definitely not allow them to just demand to see my daughter whenever they wanted to if it was not convenient for us. As you can see, it's a very, very, very different type of response than you would expect if someone's actually talking about, for example, legal rights that grandparents may have, or even like moral, ethical rights that grandparents may have. And under both circumstances, I'd say it's a little bit dodgy and probably very questionable. OP replies, we see them every weekend and sometimes in the week. It's way too much. Our weekends as a family seem to revolve around his parents, mainly my mother-in-law. And that is really where I'd say that's kind of the crux of the problem. If you feel that you as a family get zero time as your own nuclear family and you spend basically no time together, you have no weekends together because of the expectations of other family members on your time, then that's a very, very different problem than grandparents just want too much access. Of course, grandparents are generally speaking always going to be happy to see their grandkids because it's nice when you can play with kids, but then you don't have to do very much in terms of looking after them. But there are limitations to it. One person here says, I would be -1 spouse if that's the way he's acting. You need time as a nuclear family. When he chose to become a parent, his family went down on the priority list in his life. Does your family see the daughter every weekend? I have lived 5 minutes from my parents for the past 7 years. We saw them a handful of times in a month, not every weekend, not even once a week. That is too much. You basically have a custody agreement with your in-laws. Your spouse needs to remove his head from his back end here. I think that different people have very different types of relationships with their parents. I would not be okay in my family if we were super dependent on the grandparents all the time, or if they were visiting all the time. I think, honestly, there is this point when you become an adult where too much interaction with your parents just goes downhill, and it's better and healthier for you to have some good boundaries. So as a grown adult person with your own family, with your own child, with your own house, your own job, you have a separate life, and you should learn to be responsible for that life completely independently of your parents. And then you engage with each other on this level of as adults. You're not really talking as parent and child anymore because you're both equal adults in your relationship. And that dynamic has to be there for, in my opinion, a healthy relationship with adult children, right? If the relationship is not on those terms, then that's when you get into this type of conflict where you feel that one side is overbearing or is kind of trying to make too many decisions and trying to insert themselves way too far into your life. And that's, of course, frustrating. It's especially frustrating for the mother here, the wife, because she's like, hey, but we have our own family. We should be spending time together, and instead of them being able to spend time together, they're sharing all of their time with the in-laws, which sounds exhausting. Now, all that said, I think that people really exaggerate very quickly when they're like, okay, I would get rid of my husband if this was the case. I don't think that you need to be quite so intense about it, but I do think that there needs to be a conversation there in terms of what does he perceive the grandparents' role in his life, in their son's life, or their daughter's life, even in their daughter's life, and what exactly they're aiming for. Why do the grandparents need to see them 3-4 times a week? That's quite a lot. Next comment says, why do you feel like your parents get full access to our child? Is that how it was with your grandparents? He needs to give you real reasons that this should be a thing, or understand that it's ridiculous and you don't have shared rights to your child with them. And OP replies, good response. I wish I had thought of that tonight. He invited them over tonight without telling me, even though we're seeing them tomorrow, and saw them last Sunday, and we'll probably see them Christmas Day for an hour or so, because he'll say that mother-in-law needs to see our daughter on Christmas Day. And there you see the fundamental problem that always comes up, especially with in-laws, is when the married couple does not have a shared understanding of how often they want to see the in-laws, what's reasonable. Is it okay to just invite them over without asking the wife, without even telling the wife? These are not quite, I wouldn't say that they're pretty fundamental, but in terms of just having a nice, healthy, happy home and not getting into fights with each other, then you kind of need a little bit of respect towards each other and a little bit of negotiation as well. You can't just go into it with, I can do whatever I want. And it seems a little bit like the husband in this case is just making unilateral decisions about their child, the child's interactions in relationship with the grandmother, with the grandparents as well, but especially the grandmother. And for whatever reason, he just does not take his wife's opinion seriously here. And there is this point when you move on from a relationship, or you move on, when you get married, what happens is that suddenly you are no longer a member of your parents' family. You now have your own little nuclear family that you're building, and that's where your primary focus and your priority should be. And when that is not there, then the marriage is always the wife was always going to feel a little bit unwanted, not taken seriously, kind of the secondary to the primary concern that you have, which is with your mother in that case. You can see here some examples of what that looks like in practice. This person replies, of course, when the parents say, grandparents can always ask, but parents can say no. I'm still trying to get my in-laws to understand this. And then OP replies, yes, my spouse can't say no because God forbid he hurts his mother's feelings. His exact words tonight were, what child wants to hurt his mother's feelings? He's 30 years old, by the way. His mother doesn't care about his feelings. When she cancels on us, it baffles me, but obviously I'm the crazy one. And then the reply that she gets from the forum is, tell him he needs to learn to say no to anyone and everyone so he can model that to your kids. Would he want your kids to be unable to say no to people? So you both need to model healthy boundaries so your kids can learn that it's okay to say no and do what's best for them, even if it disappoints others. Now, I think that fundamentally that's a good lesson to teach them. I wouldn't necessarily say you should put restrictions on your relationship with your parents in order to teach your kids what healthy boundaries look like. I think you can teach your kids what healthy boundaries look like without that. But I think the fundamental argument here is what are they missing out on as a family? What else would they be doing with their time if they weren't tied to the grandparents all the time? And to what extent does having to see the grandparents so often reduce the kind of, I guess, lessen their relationship because they just can't spend enough time together? And as a family, they also don't spend all that much time. OP says, you're right, his mom is controlling, but he's to blame too. He thinks that he should be able to take our daughter without me to see his mom. And yes, he's right that he should be able to, but I feel uncomfortable about it because I see her so much already. And then this is the point at which I felt a little bit like OP is kind of just being a little bit unreasonable. Honestly, if I didn't want to spend a ton of time with grandparents and my in-laws still want to see my kid, and my husband is also up for taking him, that I would personally just be like, yeah, sure, you can go hang out. I think that she is struggling to set boundaries with them because the husband doesn't agree with her. And then instead of being reasonable about how to try to get on the same page with the husband, she's kind of vetoing him doing things with the son, or with the daughter. Sorry, I keep misspeaking there. With the daughter. And that's not very fair either. The final comment that I wanted to read out here is this one. She says, I thought this post was a court-based grandparent rights based off the title. My fingers were ready to go. I'm currently being sued by my child's parental grandmother, I guess she means paternal grandmother, for visitation rights. She's held him one time for less than a minute. So yeah. Going off that, absolutely no one is entitled to time with your child. Being a grandparent is a privilege, not a right. Nuclear family time should always come first. I mean, if you're miserable, then the nuclear family is going to suffer. I wouldn't even spend once a month with my mother-in-law. I would rather die. If your husband wants to spend so much time with them, then he can go while you and your daughter make other plans. My child is not an emotional support animal for people that need to see them. My child has relationships with healthy individuals. I don't believe anyone gets to decide to see someone else's child. This generation of grandparents is absolutely ridiculous. They feel so entitled to others' children. I mean, did they see their grandparents that much? No. I didn't have my child to have everyone else take up all the free time with them. I think this is exactly right. That kind of really summarizes this idea that being a grandparent is a privilege, it is not a right. And so in order to have good relationships with your grandchildren, you need to maintain healthy relationships with your kids as well. Unfortunately for OP, the fundamental problem that she's experiencing here is quite simply that her husband just doesn't agree. And so how do you get the husband to agree is a very, very complicated question. I would really argue for it from this angle of, hey, we should have priority as a nuclear family. There are other things that I want us to spend our time doing. And the arguments that he seems to have in terms of hurting his mother's feelings and so on, like, it should be okay to say no to seeing your mother sometimes without that hurting her feelings. Like, it sounds to me like he's a little bit too under her thumb, his mother's thumb, at this point in time. And he's already 30 years old. So he's old enough to be a grown adult man, to be able to make his own decisions. And he needs to somehow separate that a little bit. So in this case, I would argue that it is more that the husband is the weak one rather than the in-laws being the overbearing ones.